and participants are still coming, which is good. Pozdravljam, profesor Kovač.
Pozdravljeni, zelo vesel.
Should we wait 5 more minutes before we start?
Okay.
Because we have, I mean, I see people coming, so let's, we will try to stick to the schedule as much as possible, but let's give 3-4 minutes for people to come to join us.
For those who are not speaking, please mute your microphone so that we don't have noises.
So shall we start? On va commencer.
Okay.
So now I'm in a bit of I don't know whether to start the introduction in English or in French, because initially we said let's start in French, and I will stick to that. So to see really the value of the intercultural dialogue that we are going to speak today. So as I said, it's only the introductory remarks, and afterwards we will be back to English, as well as if you have for participants, for attendees, if you have any questions, feel free to ask whether in English or in French. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue. Bienvenue tous au 4e webinaire du projet CITIMIG. Si vous ne connaissez pas encore ce projet, il s'agit de Citizens Looking for Multidimensional Migration Challenges, qui est soutenu par le programme de l'Union européenne Europe pour les citoyens. Il me faut tout d'abord remercier à ESDES, donc École de commerce et management à Lyon, et au mouvement paneuropéen autrichien pour l'organisation de cet événement. Si vous êtes en courant avec le projet et nos activités, donc vous le savez très bien que le sujet principal du projet est de discuter des défis de migration en Europe. Les dernières 3 webinaires ont été conçus aux questions de sécurité, économie sociale, intégration, démographie, etc. Tandis que le sujet de ce webinaire d'aujourd'hui, c'est le dialogue interculturel. C'est un sujet que l'Europe a même beaucoup négligé dans quelques dernières années, même a été un otage de débats politiques, plus ou moins extrémistes. Néanmoins, ce thème reste l'un des plus importants car il s'agit de la cohésion de l'Europe. Il y a presque pas de débat dans les institutions européennes sur la valeur et l'importance du dialogue interculturel, et particulièrement pour l'avenir de l'Europe. Donc, comme vous avez déjà noté, c'est un webinaire bilingue, un geste avec lequel nous voulons montrer l'interculturalité de notre projet européen. Alors, c'est pour cela que nous avons décidé d'ouvrir un débat sur ce sujet avec les experts qui viennent de domaines différents. Donc, c'est mon grand honneur et fierté d'avoir aujourd'hui avec nous 3 personnes qui sont très reconnues dans leur pays et en Europe et ont une vision claire de ce que le dialogue interculturel devrait signifier pour l'avenir de l'Europe. Alors, permettez-moi de commencer avec le premier conférencier, professeur Olivier Maillard, directeur de l'ESDES. Donc, merci encore une fois d'être parmi nous, avec nous, et je vous donne la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Dejan. Merci aussi à Reinhard et à Sandra d'avoir organisé cette 4e édition de ce colloque extrêmement intéressant. Je suis très heureux de vous accueillir avec nos partenaires autrichiens et slovènes du mouvement paneuropéen. Évidemment, j'aurais préféré vous accueillir en vrai sur le campus de Lyon, mais les conditions sanitaires ne l'ont pas permis. Alors, malgré tout, grâce à ce nouveau monde virtuel qui s'ouvre à nous, nous pouvons heureusement nous réunir et débattre ensemble des questions de multiculturalisme. Alors, moi, je suis doyen d'une école de management au sein de l'Université catholique de Lyon. Et le multiculturalisme, le dialogue interculturel est évidemment un sujet quotidien. Vous le savez sans doute, hein, plus de 5 millions d'étudiants traversent les frontières chaque année pour suivre leurs études à l'étranger. C'est presque 2 fois plus qu'il y a 10 ans. Et l'Union européenne est aujourd'hui la zone la plus attractive. 30% des étudiants choisissent d'étudier sur le continent européen. Et je crois qu'on peut être fier du système éducatif et des programmes européens qui continuent malgré tout de séduire le monde entier. Alors pour faire face à ce nouvel afflux d'étudiants internationaux, toujours plus nombreux, je vais vous parler des écoles de management françaises, que je connais le mieux évidemment. Hein. Ces écoles ont développé des programmes d'enseignement en anglais. Mais elles ont également cherché à préserver la possibilité d'offrir la possibilité aux étudiants internationaux de s'initier au français, mais aussi de découvrir la culture française. Nos écoles ont aussi renforcé leur corps enseignant en recrutant un nombre toujours croissant de professeurs internationaux. Alors, cela signifie que les écoles de management françaises sont devenues un terrain d'expérimentation en matière de multiculturalisme. À l'ESDES, qui est l'école que je dirige, et qui est une école de taille assez modeste par rapport aux concurrents internationaux, les 45 enseignants-chercheurs qui font partie du corps Faculté représentent aujourd'hui 12 nationalités. Et l'école compte aujourd'hui plus de 15% d'étudiants internationaux. Tout cela, évidemment, impacte la manière dont les cours sont dispensés, la manière dont, en tant que dean, je dois manager le corps professoral, mais aussi la manière dont je dois recruter du staff qui doit désormais maîtriser 2, voire 3 langues différentes. Les références culturelles ne sont pas les mêmes, mais la mondialisation fait maintenant partie de notre quotidien. Et ce n'est pas un mince challenge pour un directeur comme moi de préserver l'harmonie et de faire progresser chacun dans le même sens. Alors, que dire des jeunes cadres diplômés de ces écoles de management internationales, habitués à travailler avec des étudiants chinois, indiens et africains qui font partie de leur promotion, qui ont vécu l'expatriation plusieurs fois, au moins pendant leur semestre Erasmus. Ces jeunes cadres sont maintenant habitués à voyager partout en Europe, partout dans le monde, à travers des cultures particulières, à gérer des codes non européens dans le domaine des affaires comme de la vie de tous les jours. Et ceci est extrêmement riche et c'est particulièrement excitant de travailler à l'émergence d'une nouvelle génération de managers prêts à dialoguer avec toutes les cultures. Alors évidemment, en tant que Français, je formule aussi le souhait que nous accueillons toujours plus d'étudiants internationaux du monde entier. enrichissant ainsi notre mode de travail et diffusant un petit peu plus l'art de vivre à la française. Voilà, je ne vais pas être beaucoup plus long. Je remercie encore Reinhard, Dejan et Sandra d'avoir organisé concrètement ce webinaire et je souhaite à chacun et chacun d'entre vous des échanges extrêmement riches. Merci.
Merci à vous. Merci pour ces mots d'introduction. Oui, je suis complètement d'accord. Dans le domaine de recherche, l'éducation, c'est très, très important de maintenir un environnement interculturel. Donc, c'est vraiment quelque chose que nous enrichit. Bon, merci encore une fois. Alors, je donnerai la parole au deuxième conférencier, qui est notre grand ami européen, professeur Edvard Kovač. Lui, il est professeur de philosophie et théologie très reconnu en Slovénie et aussi en France et en Europe. Avant de donner la parole au professeur, je voudrais souligner que lui, il était l'un des deux orateurs principaux en 2008 avec Jan Figel, le commissaire européen, à l'époque, si je ne me trompe pas, à l'ouverture du président slovène au Conseil de l'Union européenne. D'ailleurs, si vous vous souvenez, l'année 2008 était l'année européenne du dialogue interculturel. Alors, professeur Kovač, veuillez prendre la parole. Il faut que vous... Voilà, très bien.
Monsieur le Président, merci beaucoup pour cette invitation. Merci beaucoup pour, chers collègues, Olivier et Maillard, d'avoir un Lyonnais, un Toulousain, voilà, qui se rencontrent grâce à la Slovénie. La joie d'être avec vous. Donc, pour moi, c'est un grand honneur. Donc, je suis un peu nerveux, peut-être un peu plus, comme j'ai parlé au commencement de la présidence de la Slovénie pour l'Europe, parce que maintenant, vous êtes ici pas pour les protocoles, mais vous êtes ceux qui pensent, et ceux qui pensent, c'est toujours très critique. Je voudrais vous dire quelque chose. Bien sûr, je suis d'origine slovène, j'enseigne aussi à l'université de Ljubljana. Je me sens un peu porte-parole de la culture française à l'université de Ljubljana et vice-versa, aussi de la culture slovène et peut-être aussi européenne à l'université de Toulouse. Donc, je voudrais quand même signaler que ce qui est formidable, c'est que nous, les non-français, nous aimons venir en France parce que à l'université française, c'est le lieu où on pense. Voilà. Et donc, je suis aussi le produit de cette université parce que mes grands maîtres ont été Emmanuel Levinas et Paul Ricoeur. Et je l'ai connu personnellement aussi. Donc, je commence avec cette idée qui est la base de la rencontre, du dialogue interculturel, qui est l'hospitalité. L'hospitalité, bien sûr, qui est d'origine de la culture humaine. L'homme a survécu parce qu'il était capable de demander et offrir l'hospitalité. Et aujourd'hui aussi, nous préparons l'avenir de l'Europe, l'avenir de la civilisation qui est basée sur l'hospitalité. Donc, Paul Ricoeur, il parle aussi de l'hospitalité herméneutique. Je voudrais revenir à ça. De quoi il s'agit? Il s'agit d'une idée que nous accueillons quelqu'un par l'hospitalité. Ça veut dire dans le grand respect de sa culture, de sa langue, de sa religion aussi, de sa spiritualité, de son savoir. Donc, on l'accueille avec les bras ouverts, avec la générosité. Et de l'autre côté, c'est lui qui vient. Il est heureux d'être bien accueilli. C'est pourquoi il exprime notre respect. Respect de la maison dans laquelle il est accueilli, respect de l'université qui l'accueille. Il accepte aussi le jeu du langage, le jeu culturel et le jeu de la rencontre. Et maintenant, il y a certaines difficultés qui commencent. Au-delà des langues, parce qu'on peut apprendre les langues de communication. Maintenant, il y a la langue de la compréhension profonde. Et ici, un vrai dialogue est nécessaire. Ici, je voudrais aussi signaler un autre philosophe, cette fois-ci un philosophe allemand qui est Gadamer, qui parle de deux horizons qui devraient se rencontrer. Chacun a son horizon. Et dans ces deux horizons, dans cette rencontre, il y a le dialogue dans lequel nous cherchons ce qui est commun pour bien s'entendre. Et donc, vous voyez, dialogue, comme dit le mot grec, c'est la parole entre nous, la parole qui appartient à tout le monde et qui est la parole commune, qui est aussi, si vous voulez, la maison commune de l'Europe. Et donc, ici, je voudrais dire, il y a certaines difficultés. Les difficultés est telle que la plupart, pas simplement d'Erasmus, aussi de pays d'outre-mer, les pays méditerranéens, de Nord-Afrique ou des Africains, et d'autres aussi Amérique latine, on constate que dans cette culture, dans ce respect de la parole et dans cette éthique commune qui est là, chez les autres, la religion est présente. Et donc, vous voyez comment c'est difficile dans cette rencontre, si pour quelqu'un qui vient parmi nous, l'absence de la religion, c'est une décadence. Et donc, comment faire le dialogue avec quelqu'un qui nous tolère dans le sens latin du monde, qui nous porte avec la souffrance tolérée et qui a beaucoup de difficultés de nous respecter. Il nous respecte par notre savoir technique, mais on voit que le dialogue technique n'est pas suffisant. Le philosophe Heidegger a dit que la science technique ne pense pas, mais pour le dialogue, il faut penser. Et donc, c'est pourquoi, je ne sais pas dans quelle perspective, ce colloque, cette rencontre tellement riche, je suis enthousiaste de ce que vous avez organisé, va aller, mais simplement, il faut dire que pour la plupart des gens qui viennent extérieur de l'Europe, la religion, c'est quelque chose qui est constitutif à l'éthique. C'est pourquoi ce que je propose, c'est aussi que cet humanisme laïque et sécularisé que nous vivons soit présenté aussi avec les valeurs profondes, les valeurs qui sont sacrées, les valeurs surtout qu'une femme est respectée même si elle est habillée autrement et qu'un enfant est respecté, que la vie est toujours respectée. Donc si nous sommes capables de réussir de mettre les bases du dialogue, de la rencontre avec un horizon commun, sera formidable et nous serons capables de pratiquer l'hospitalité l'un et l'autre, chacun dans sa culture, et s'enrichir mutuellement. Donc, bonne chance, bon courage, pensez bien et soyez généreux. Enrichissez-nous. Et merci beaucoup. En avant.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Kovač, pour cette allocation. Ce que vous avez dit, voilà, des valeurs, le respect, c'est en fait la base du dialogue entre n'importe quelle culture. Donc, merci beaucoup encore une fois. Alors, notre troisième conférencier, si je peux continuer, je ne suis pas sûr si je dois faire une grande introduction, parce que c'est M. Karl von Habsburg, le président du mouvement paneuropéen autrichien, tout le monde lui connaît. Donc, j'ai besoin de vous rappeler peut-être de son allocution sur l'avenir de l'Europe qu'il avait au début de janvier cette année et où il a mis en place ces idées très concrètes de développement de l'intégration européen, où le dialogue interculturel joue un rôle très important. Alors, Monsieur Habsburg, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, c'est très gentil. Merci beaucoup, professeur Maillard, professeur Kovač, pour vos mots. Je m'excuse beaucoup de fois. J'aimerais bien commencer en slovène, mais malheureusement, je ne suis pas capable de faire cela comme ça. Mais je vais changer maintenant en anglais parce que ça, c'est bien sûr une topic sur lequel je parle beaucoup en anglais. Et quand on peut user les deux différentes langues, je vais commencer avec ça. Dear friends, it is, and dear Dejan, thank you very much. Dear Reinhard, thank you very much. I think it is an incredibly interesting topic. I mean, you know, it is something which is very close to my heart to talk about the intercultural dialogue. Although I'll take sometimes a little bit more of a sinister approach to it. So I'm very grateful to Professor Maillard and Professor Kovač that they have kind of pointed out the positive side of the potential intercultural dialogue, but I try and look at it in a very critical way, because of course in my line of work, I have to work very often with, let's say, the dark side of the dialogue or the absence of this dialogue. And therefore, I think it is incredibly important to talk about the definition, what this intercultural dialogue actually is, because we think it is much too easy if we think this is a dialogue between cultures. That is profoundly wrong. Cultures don't have a dialogue. Humans have dialogues. People have dialogues. Two people have dialogues. And if people have dialogues, automatically there is the identity question that comes up. There is the eccentricity question that comes up in every single personality, which kind of makes this dialogue not something which is fluent and easy, but it makes it full of twists and turns and edges and difficulties to define. I always think probably the best way to define something is to define it through its opposite. I mean, what is the opposite of the intercultural dialogue? It is not necessarily the absence of this dialogue, but probably the opposite to the intercultural dialogue is the American way of multiculturalism. And the multiculturalism is something which to some degree has worked in the United States. And even there, I do have my doubts. Because let's put it just this way, in the beginning, when the concept of the United States by its founders were created, they were thinking about an area where people would come to, would merge in, would assimilate, and would speak the same language. When we know that in a couple of years, the majority language in the United States of America will most likely be Spanish and not English anymore, that already shows that probably this original concept is not exactly working that way anymore. And I think when we are looking at the clearer definition of the intercultural dialogue, we also see the point where, let's say, Fukuyama was going completely wrong with his end of history, because he was basically thinking about a linear development, of which we see that it did not work in the development of multiculturalism in the United States. It does not work on our side. We are working with individuals. We are working with identities that constantly change and that have, let's say, their great specialties, which they do not want to lose. And that brings me to Europe, where I think it is just incredibly important what makes Europe in comparison with the United States. It is not the mixture of cultures, religions, and ethnicities. It is actually the flowering of cultures, religions, and ethnicities that are living together, and that therefore they kind of they are giving to each other, and therefore they can be very successful and can be much more successful than a defined multiculturalism. But when I'm coming to, let's say, the darker side of the intercultural dialogue, and I have to speak a little bit about that because that's very much of the background of my work, it is, of course, that we have to see how necessary the intercultural dialogue is in order to avoid crises and avoid conflicts. I mean, Fukuyama in his description was basically talking about everything becoming one sort of mixture and mesh of different cultures, ethnicities, religions, whatever. And he saw a big conflict, and then he saw out of the conflict would basically come the working together. Yes, we do have a conflict all over the place. And a lot of the work that I'm doing has to do with the conflict. And I can see how the difference of cultures has an impact on those conflicts and how important it is to have this dialogue between individuals that represent cultures, religions, ethnicities in order to avoid conflicts. I just want to point out, if you look back in the history, of course, conflicts in the history were usually international conflicts, apart from civil wars, something like this. But basically, the classical international conflict does not exist in our time anymore. We have, because it is not a conflict between nations as it used to be, where armies would bash each other, but it has most of the conflicts that we are seeing today are inter-religious, inter-cultural, inter-ethnic conflicts, and not international conflicts, because it's not nations battling. And when you have cultures and when you have ethnicities and religions being in a conflict, then you see that this automatically leads to a change of what is the primary target of that conflict. So the primary target of the international conflict is always working, destroying the infrastructure of the opponent, going against the armed forces of the other nation. That's the international conflict. In the modern type of conflict, which we have seen in the last couple of decades, you see that the primary target is not the infrastructure of the opponent, but is the identity of the opponent, because you want to change something in the field of ethnicity, religion, or culture. What do? You destroy the identity of the opponent, and therefore you destroy him much more significant than just beating him in a normal battle. And this is the conflicts that we are seeing today and the direction in which conflicts are developing. And of course, as a consequence of that, we also have to be clear that the intercultural dialogue is something that we have to pay much more attention to, that we have to be much more conscious about, in order to avoid how do we tackle conflicts, how do we deal with conflicts in the future. That does not only apply to Europe. I'm extremely glad that, for example, my very, very good friend Asfa is participating today and tomorrow, because he knows better than anybody else exactly how this impacts the African continent. I really hope that he's going to make also a couple of remarks about that, and how it is also impacting, if you look in the Far East, in the conflicts which are happening there, how much this is impacting the conflicts. So there's a lot of elements that we have to discuss. I'm very, very grateful that this topic was chosen for this conference. I'm sure it's going to be really interesting to work on the definitions, to find a clearer picture of what this intercultural dialogue that we all really, really need in a positive way is going to be. So thank you very much for having me here at the beginning.
Thank you very much for these introductory remarks. I mean, yeah, you set kind of a strong basis for any further discussion, really. So thank you for this. Okay, as you see now, I switched back to English, because I would like at this point, before we continue with the first panel and before I leave the floor to my friend Reinhard Kloczek, a floor to participants, to attendees, to ask questions. So as I said, whether you ask in English or French, it doesn't matter. So feel free to raise your hands and ask questions. Ok, Professor Kovač.
Merci beaucoup pour la parole, cher monsieur Karl von Habsburg. J'ai admiré votre pensée, votre courage aussi de vous exprimer, mais ce qui est tellement riche, n'est-ce pas, que nous faisons déjà maintenant entre nous ce dialogue interculturel. Hein? Donc, nous avons tous l'expérience de ce conflit. Et vous voyez ce que nous avons constaté dans la dernière guerre balkanique, n'est-ce pas, que les conflits de religion étaient plutôt des excuses. Parce que, par exemple, même la religion orthodoxe serbe, dans sa tradition, elle a une grande valeur de l'hospitalité. Et cette grande valeur de la religion n'a pas été respectée. Et on a vu que quelqu'un s'est déclaré comme la religion orthodoxe serbe. Ils ne savent pas faire la croix, ni prier notre Père. Ça veut dire, quand il n'y a pas une vraie identité culturelle, quand la culture n'est pas créative, comme la langue n'est pas florissante, on cherche un support et on exploite, on utilise, on peut peut-être destituer, on peut exploiter, n'est-ce pas, de la région, on peut la pervertir. C'est pourquoi je crois que la base de notre rencontre, de notre dialogue devrait être l'éthique profonde. Simplement, cette éthique ne peuvent pas être que le pragmatisme. Vous avez raison de signaler que ce multiculturalisme, melting pot d'Américains, n'est pas applicable pour l'Europe. Ça veut dire, économiquement, que sur la base économique, n'est-ce pas, nous ne pouvons pas faire la base des dialogues. Donc, il faut revenir à la culture et cette culture, chercher voilà, cet humanisme et voir aussi les supports, par exemple, de l'humanisme aussi chez les penseurs musulmans comme Mircea Selimovic en Bosnie, etc. Ça veut dire, pour moi, c'est un grand défi, n'est-ce pas, comment créer un nouveau humanisme européen qui aura différents supports, les supports des différentes cultures. Excusez-moi de rentrer tout de suite dans les débats très vifs.
Merci. Est-ce que je peux voir la main? Non, il n'y en a pas. So, are there any hands? No. Il y a quelqu'un autre qui veut intervenir? Is there someone else who wants to intervene at this point? If not, then I would just... We have one. Carlos? Reinhard, Carlos raised the hand.
Yeah, but he took it down. That's why I do not find him.
Okay. Okay. If there is, as I said, then I would simply conclude the introductory remarks at this point, and I suggest to move to the first panel that is foreseen for today. So once again, all speakers, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup tous les conférenciers d'être parmi nous, d'avoir pris votre temps. Et voilà, je passe la parole, je donne la parole à Reinhard. Reinhard, please, the floor is yours and we can continue with the first panel.
Thank you very much, Dejan. Thanks a lot, Professor Maillard, Karl von Habsburg, and Professor Kovač for the introductory remarks. It's my pleasure to now moderate the first panel under the title, Why Intercultural Dialogue Matters More Than Ever in the European Union. I have three speakers in this panel, but before we come to the speakers, just some short hint how I think the procedure should be. So I will introduce the speakers, then they will have their presentations. It will be a first presentation, 10 to 15 minutes. In a second round, I would like to go into a discussion between the panelists. I'm sure that they do not agree on everything. So I hope that we can have some kind of panel discussion. And then in a third round, I would like to invite participants to ask questions. How do you ask questions? You can raise your hand, but please do not do it that way, because if you do it that way, I do not see you. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand by pressing the button you have on your screen, raise the hand, or this is the other possibility, write it into the chat or into the questions and answers section. You will find that also on your screen. So let's start with the first speaker, and the first speaker will be, we trained before, and I hope I still can pronounce it correctly, Professor Tuuli Lähdesmäki. She is from Finland, is a docent and associate professor at the Department of Music, Art and Cultural Studies at the university, and now again, a very difficult word, Jyväskylä. You will correct me if it's completely wrong. She worked a lot on intercultural dialogue, cultural identities. That question was already raised by Karl von Habsburg. Identity politics, cultural heritage and diversity, cultural policies of the European Union and the Council of Europe. She is at the moment leading a research project entitled EU Heritage Diplomacy and the Dynamics of Inter-Heritage Dialogue, funded by the Academy of Finland. I have a longer CV for her, but I'm not going to read everything about her. If you want to know more about her, and that I mentioned that because I like this video very, very much. Just enter her name in YouTube, go to YouTube, enter her name, and then you will find a 2 minutes and I don't know how many seconds movie about her. It's really great. I've never seen such a good presentation of academics at any university. Check it. Professor, the floor and also the screen is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you very much for this great introduction to me and mentioning about this a bit hilarious video, I would say. But anyway, thank you very much for the invitation to have this talk in this webinar that is, of course, extremely timely, and the topic is extremely important, as we also heard in these opening speeches. I've made a couple of slides, and I will now start sharing those with you. Okay, I suppose that you are able to see the slides. Great.
With you.
So I was happy to accept the invitation to this webinar as I have been researching in my current and previous research projects, the very concept of intercultural dialogue and how it is used in the EU's and the Council of Europe's education policies and cultural policies. And one of these projects is called DIALS, and it is a Horizon 2020 project. And in this project, me and my colleagues published last year a book which forms the basis to my talk today. And I will come back to this project a bit later. But the core question to us three speakers in this panel is, why does intercultural dialogue matter more than ever in the EU? And I think that it is very easy to argue why it matters in today's EU that is increasingly diverse in terms of culture, religion, languages, ways of living, and so on and so forth. And we can also easily argue that intercultural dialogue is important in the EU that has become more polarized due to the rise of xenophobic, anti-immigration, racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic and Islamophobic attitudes in Europe. But I claim that intercultural dialogue has mattered in the EU already for a long time. And of course, diversification and polarization are not only contemporary issues, and the EU has been concerned about these issues already for decades. So I will start my talk by taking a quick look how and why intercultural dialogue as a concept has emerged in the EU policy discourse and how it is currently defined by the EU. And then I will take a look at the criticism that this concept has faced in scholarship and what are the ways to respond to these challenges that this concept may entail. Okay, so moving to the next slide. So why and when and why did the EU start to get interested in intercultural dialogue? So the European Union has often followed in its policy discourses and in its vocabulary the Council of Europe and how the Council of Europe has formed its rhetorical and conceptual formulations. And these have been then followed by the European Union with a short delay, and particularly in questions related to culture. And this is also what happened in the case of intercultural dialogue. So the emergence of the concept in the Council of Europe's and the EU's policy discourses can be timed to the beginning of the 2000s. And at that time, the Council of Europe started a process that resulted first in several declarations emphasizing this concept, and then finally in the white paper on intercultural dialogue that was published in 2008. And simultaneously, the EU included this concept in its European Agenda for Culture in a Globalizing World, and then celebrated the European Year of Intercultural Dialogue. And one of the goals of this year was to raise awareness of this concept in Europe. And also this concept was defined as a priority area in EU cultural programs. And since then, intercultural dialogue has become a part of the core vocabulary in different EU policy sectors, from citizenship to culture and from education to sport and so on. So why? What is the reason for this? We have to remember that policy discourse is a genre that seeks to respond to or tackle some existing problems or threats. So what were those at the beginning of the 2000s? A bit over a decade ago, several leading European politicians at that time, such as Angela Merkel, Nicolas Sarkozy, and David Cameron, for instance, publicly criticized multiculturalism policies by declaring those as failed. So these politicians, as well as several scholars at that time, claimed that multiculturalism as a diversity policy has failed to create cohesion among different cultures living side by side or in their own enclaves, as they claimed, in multicultural societies. And for these actors, interculturalism as a policy and intercultural dialogue as a practice to instrumentalize it were seen as a solution to these challenges. Well, since then, also other scholars have included or take part in this discussion about these concepts and these policies and claim that this kind of conceptual move hasn't actually solved anything. And the politicians have just blamed multiculturalism because they failed themselves to implement their own diversity policies. But still today, the EU builds its understanding on intercultural dialogue on the critique of multiculturalism. And you can see this red brief text on the slide, and this is how the European Commission's website defined intercultural dialogue, saying that it is essentially the exchange of views and opinions between different cultures, and unlike multiculturalism, where the focus is on the preservation of separate cultures, intercultural dialogue seeks to establish linkages and common ground between different cultures, communities, and people, and promoting understanding and interaction. So there are various scholars who have also recognized certain shortcomings in intercultural dialogue as a concept and as a policy and practice. So this very concept was developed to respond to increasing cultural diversity in Western societies and to promote interaction, mutual respect, and understanding between different people coming from with different backgrounds. So despite these premises, the concept has been criticized in academia for treating cultures as internally homogeneous. And these critics have noted that the concept may actually categorize people into separate and clearly identifiable cultural units. Also in diversified societies, cultural differences are very intersectional and do not follow any clear demarcations. Many of the critical views emphasize power imbalances in discourses, policies, and practices of intercultural dialogue. So it has been perceived as a profoundly Western concept through which Western scholars and societies seek to deal with non-Western others and promote their feeling of belonging to Western societies and becoming part of these societies. And there are also scholars who have claimed that this concept is a bit elitist due to these reasons, for instance. And scholars have also pointed out how policy discourses in intercultural dialogue may include Western or Eurocentric perspectives on diversity and cultural differences, and thus implicitly consolidating differences between Westerners or Europeans and then the others, and thus constructing these kind of positions of us and them. In my own articles, I have indicated how policy discourses on intercultural dialogue may include power hierarchies between those who are expected to facilitate the dialogue and those who are expected only to participate in it, and often now meaning those non-European others who are only expected to participate. So as intercultural dialogue policies commonly aim to tackle various challenges related to increased cultural diversity in Western societies, their discourses can unintentionally present the coexistence of cultures as a problem or as a source of conflict, which is of course contradictory to the very fundamental principle of intercultural dialogue. And the concept has also been criticized for emphasizing talk over other means of expression, as the idea of dialogue privileges those who have capacity and voice to speak, and also common language to do it. And then scholars, and including myself also, have criticized policymakers for defining the concept very vaguely and also explaining it really ambiguously. And my own research has also emphasized how particularly European policy discourses often approach intercultural dialogue in a very universalizing manner and poorly recognizing the societal and historical differences between European societies and population groups in them. For instance, diversity in Eastern part of Europe is very different than diversity in Western part of Europe. And comparing these different countries kind of makes it visible how diversities are very diverse. And finally, even though researchers often mention empathy as a core aspect of intercultural dialogue, I've noted how policies and practices of intercultural dialogue address it less. And I think that this is a major shortcoming. So all this means that intercultural dialogue is not a simple concept, as we already heard. And scholars and policymakers and educators and so on should be aware of these kind of shortcomings that this concept may entail in their work. So now I'm coming back to this DIALS project that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. This project is based on a call in which the European Union wanted to finance a project that would enable young people to build the skills needed for intercultural dialogue through cultural literacy. And here the European Union had taken a new term to deal with intercultural dialogue, this cultural literacy. That was in the call text. And the Union wanted the researchers to develop this concept. So in DIALS, we have defined cultural literacy as a process of really engaging with cultures and as a co-creation, a co-expression of cultural identities and values. So it's about learning and gaining cultural knowledge together through empathetic and inclusive interaction with others. So for us, this term cultural literacy is not about knowledge of culture or knowledge of history of other people. And we even claim that that kind of factual knowledge of cultures and heritages and histories as the only element for encountering other people may direct to perceive people as only stable representatives of their culture or community. And this may even lead to cultural stereotyping that hinders perceiving people as individuals. And we have identified two core skills for cultural literacy. So empathy enables people to encounter, understand, and include different perspectives, people, and values. And then the skill of collaboration is also essential. So to collaborate well, people should value diversity, respect others, and be willing to both overcome prejudice and also be able to compromise. And both of these skills require practice. So to practice cultural literacy, in this project, we have created a cultural literacy learning program, as we call it. And it was implemented last year in 7 countries with around 5,000 students age from 5 to 15. And the results have been really encouraging. And we have received really good feedback from our teachers and students who participated in this program. But this program is a story of its own. So I think I will stop here. But if you got interested in this program, so you may visit the website of the project. You see the website address on the end of the slide. But I think I will stop here and end my talk to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. I'm not going to comment on anything because I would like to go directly to the next speaker. And the speaker comes from France, from Lyon, Kevin Pont, who is Associate Dean for International Development and Accreditations at ESDS. He obtained his PhD in management from the University of Buckinghamshire and has published articles in the International Strategy of Companies and Management School. He teaches at ESDS in undergraduate and postgraduate studies and has more than 25 years of experience in management teaching and had various positions in other schools. Professor, as far as I know, you will also show us some slides.
Yes, that's correct.
The microphone and the screen is yours.
Thank you. I will just try and get up the PowerPoint on my screen. Oh dear, it's not coming up for some reason. Let's see if it's there. I did send you the PowerPoint. Do you have it on your screen?
I have it on my computer.
Because I cannot find...
If it does not work...
Oh, can you see it now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, can you... it's on my screen now. Can you see...
I don't see it at the moment, but just go on.
Right, let me just see if I can... right, no, I think I've got your screen on mine at the moment.
Yeah, because I created on my computer. So.
Ah, right, okay. Well, if you could put it, my PowerPoint, if you could show my PowerPoint, because I'm having difficulties here.
Okay, okay. You see my screen at the moment?
Yes.
Okay, so I will open your presentation. Just a second. There is a PowerPoint. That's it.
Right, and if I could just tell you then when to put on the next screen, I'll tell you when to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, there we are. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I must admit that being British, I was wondering if I still should talk to you about European Union cultural dialogue since Brexit is now officially over and done with. So I'd still like to thank you for giving me the opportunity of speaking for a few minutes about this. My claim is that I'm French as well, so hopefully that will save me and give some substance to European Union and cultural dialogue. I'd like to start off by asking a couple of questions, which I may not answer during all of them during my speech, but it may give some food for thought. Firstly, I'd like to think, well, does it actually exist? I mean, we're 27 countries within the European Union. So is there one European cultural dialogue? If it does exist, does it mean the same for everyone? Do we all stick to the same rules? Do we all understand it? Or are there different intercultural misunderstandings which we continue to avoid? The next question then is, do Europeans really want a European cultural dialogue, or would they prefer to be the same? My next question then is, can we communicate without it? And how can we dialogue if it does not exist? So those are a couple of stimulating questions that we could ask ourselves. And if we go on to the next slide, perhaps one of the first things we can look at is the European Cultural Dialogue heaven is where the cooks are French, the mechanics are Germans, the police are British, the lovers are Italians, and the organizers are Swiss. Now, these are only stereotypes, but they are nevertheless have some substance to them, and which seems to indicate that we are all different and that by definition, we all have culturally different competences and skills, which lead us to dialogue and communicate in different ways. So within Europe of today, if we move on to the next slide, we can see that we are not one single Euro culture and dialogue, that we do speak and exchange in different ways. Differences do exist, and they don't seem to go away easily. The European Union has been in existence for many years, and we still have these cultural differences with us and the way of communication. And this can be seen, especially, I'm taking my references from business and management because I work in a business school, from international business, and companies adapt their way of doing business in different ways in different parts of Europe. We all think that, okay, McDonald's is the same and they want to work and dialogue in the same way, but in fact, it's not that straightforward. A couple of months ago, we had some, in McDonald's in France, a cheeseburger week, which we had different cheeses. There are over 365 cheeses in France, which I can't name, but we all like them. They're very important for us. So it's very, very important to look at these differences and to ensure that we can communicate in specific ways in order to carry out our daily tasks. And it's not just in France that exists. There are other variations as well in different countries, in Spain, for example. Move to the next slide. Okay. There is no common mother tongue within Europe. Okay. We all speak our different nationalities, as we've seen here today. We all have different mother tongues and we all speak and act in different ways. We can, okay, say that possibly English is the common language between us, but we are bound by our internal culture of how we use that language and what we portray to other people. So the question we can ask ourselves is, does an Italian dialogue in English in exactly the same way as a French person who speaks English? The answer is no, because although we can be speaking in one single language, there may be some misunderstandings which can cause problems. And they do happen. This happens both in non-verbal and verbal dialogue as well throughout the European Union and indeed within the world as well. If we move to the next slide, please. Okay. Now, dialogue is very important in the working environment. And over the past year, we've all experienced COVID-19, and that's radically changed our way of working and our way of dialogue within Europe. We can see, and today, and this moment is a typical example, video conferencing has replaced face-to-face meetings. We haven't been able to travel as much or not at all in some cases. So we've had to resort to different medias to communicate, which can bring about problems of misunderstandings as well, even though we're still speaking within one language. And the other thing that's changed as well for dialogue to be on the increase is that people who would never have met before COVID-19 are now meeting on the internet and talking through Teams, Zoom, etc. So the population number is increasing more and more people are communicating with each other, and which they would not have done in previous time had COVID not existed. So the actual sanitary condition of COVID has actually stimulated the idea of us needing to dialogue more and more and in a standard version because more and more people are doing this. So this is extremely important when we look at, and in order to reduce the misunderstandings that we're having between us. We have the next slide. Okay. Now, what can we do then possibly to correct this and have dialogue that should be understood and avoid these misunderstandings? Now, obviously, higher education has an extremely important role to play on this, whereas in the past, obviously, we've had, especially within the European Union, the Erasmus initiative, which has supported financially and structurally exchanges for students to go and visit one country and to study with the others more and more in order to understand dialogue and talk with different nationalities. We have now, and again, a positive outcome of COVID is that higher education is getting more involved with COIL initiatives, which is collaboration on online international learning, where we're using Teams and Zoom for people to interact and dialogue and see how they work and see what differences there are. And so the student and faculty exchanges are both physical and now also both online. But are we doing enough? Is it too late? Should we be starting at an earlier date? And should secondary education become involved more and more on this? And so we should need to solve this intercultural problem is for students and pupils at school to take an objective role in order to pay more attention to this. Just before I finish and before you see the final slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about an experiment that was carried out between 3 different nationalities of engineers, German engineers, British engineers, and French engineers. And to add another culture into the experiment, there was a Danish company, which we all know, called Lego, implied in the experiment. And each group of national engineers were given 2,000 Lego bricks. And the objective was to build the tallest tower that they could from the 2,000 Lego bricks. And the experiment was actually filmed on camera. And it was very interesting to see how the 3 different nationalities reacted. You had the group of 4 British engineers, which were in a room, and they immediately started to build. No dialogue, no talking, just started to build. The French were sitting round a table, talking, analyzing, and saying, well, how should we do it? Should it be square? Should it be round? Should it be triangular? And eventually they started. The Germans were the last people to talk and start to build this tower, because they were analyzing at a much longer and lengthier time in order to foresee any possible problems that would come in building this tower. So once they all got started, that's not the interesting part. What the interesting part is when all the towers fell down because they hadn't been built correctly. And it's the reaction after that little catastrophe is interesting to analyze and to look at the discourse and the European discourse that does or does not exist. The British team automatically started again. Didn't think, just started, well, it's fallen down, let's try again and see if we can do better this time. The Germans, on the other hand, said, well, because we've looked at every angle possible, we can then conclude that it's probably impossible to construct these Lego bricks and towers. The French were in the middle of the 2 extremities. And what happened? The French started talking again and building, and only 3 of the 4 engineers were actually building the tower. The 4th person, the 4th engineer, was sitting down, giving orders to the other 3 engineers of what to do. Now, this experiment is a very, very important illustration of the differences of how we need to break down our different communication cross-cultural dialogues so that we can work together. If you can now imagine the problems there would have been if we put the British with the Germans to build the tower, where the British are much more ideally ready actions to start work and the Germans want to plan and analyze things in much more detail, you can imagine the dialogue that there would have been between the 2 groups on saying, when should we start, when should we not start, what should we analyze? Okay, so we can see there's a difference in the communication, or there would be, and dispute. We can also see that within the French group, there may be a conflict and dialogue problems of hierarchy and power distance there. Would the British or the Germans accept for one person to sit down and give the orders just through natural order, or would there have to be a natural pecking order to choose that person? And there's also the idea of the avoidance of risks as well. We're all different. So in Europe, we still haven't come to this European Union cross-cultural dialogue unity. We need to work with it. We possibly don't need to produce the unique cultural dialogue, but we do need to show empathy and to ensure that we understand that it exists, and we have to work around it so that it is no longer a problem to work with. If we don't, we might come to a situation which I've illustrated in my final slide, which if we could look at now, we might come to a European cultural dialogue hell, where the cooks are British, the mechanics are French, the police are Germans, the lovers are Swiss, and the organizers are Italians. So to have an intercultural, unique dialogue policy may not be possible, but it is certainly possible for us to understand that it doesn't exist and that we need to work together in order to solve our differences and move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul. Is this correct pronounced, Paul?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
This was now a ride from heaven to hell.
That's right.
I prefer the other direction.
Well, that's why I said it would be, if we understand the differences and show empathy, it is therefore we will avoid the cultural hell and remain in the cultural heaven of Europe.
Yes. Now we have an Italian speaker as next. I don't know if Professor Marco Lombardi is an organizer, but he can react to it now. Great to see you again, Professor. Professor Marco Lombardi is director of the Department of Sociology and the director of Italian Team for Security, Terroristic Issues and Managing Emergencies Research Center. This is a very, very long name. And maybe that's also typical Italian, that you have long and good sounding names for institutions, whereas other cultures have shorter and precise names. He is a full professor at the Catholic University of Sacred Heart in Milano, where he teaches crisis management and risk communication, mass communication theory, sociology, intelligence, and counterterrorism. He's much involved in security questions, cooperates with different agencies on national, international level, and is also a member of the Government Commission on Counter-Radicalization and of the Strategic Policy Committee of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, which also has to do with communication. Professor, please.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation, and thanks, very happy to be here. And let me first answer Kevin. I can say that for sure, no Italians dialogue in English in exactly the same way as a French person, Kevin. I can assure. It's completely different perspective we have. But thanks, I go directly to our question, why intercultural dialogue matters more than ever in the EU. I love this question. Finally, culture is once again an important topic of politics. And briefly, I want to present the points I'm going to discuss. Intercultural dialogue, which is at the heart of the debate, has been described as a process that qualifies globalization and network society, both of which are seen as positive trends and, above all, bearers of equality. This is unrealistic from my point of view. It is the result of outdated ideological bias. Interculturality must be expressed in the ability to maintain in relation a multiplicity of nodes of the network that are profoundly different from each other. This is the challenge of global governance. Let me try to answer the question of today's webinar, but also reshaping it. Are we sure that the intercultural dialogue is all important in Europe? And I use the word Europe instead of EU first. I believe that in most of the world, it is an emerging issue, perhaps especially in Europe. There are two reasons for this, a structural reason and a historical reason. But first, a brief premise. Intercultural dialogue underlines and reinforces the sense of communication that already characterize the two concepts, intercultural and dialogue. Intercultural itself is a booster of the meaning of communication. Inter expresses a relationship between different objects. Cultural, that refers to culture, are the object exchanged during the relationship and the communication process. Cultural objects make communication possible. And more, they make dialogue possible, our second concept, which strengthens the communication perspective. Dialogue itself expresses communication as proactive, responsible, participated, a consciousness process between people. Let me say that from this perspective, intercultural dialogue is a key communication process characterizing the entire world, not only Europe. Much better, what I call the globalized and networked society of the world. As I said, there are two reasons that I wish to underline the importance of the intercultural dialogue, a structural reason and an historical reason. The structural reason has to do with the world organization we describe as global and networking. Start with globalization, which is a daily topic of discussion, but a misunderstood process, because we attempt to fit into the model of interpretation of the past without making the conceptual leap involving a change that is radical. Globalization is generally explained as complexity because the increasing in the number of relationships between nodes of a network becoming denser and denser. There is an hypothesis behind, and the hypothesis is that the nodes tend to resemble one to the other. Each node becomes similar to the other nodes of the network in the globalization process. This happens according to a principle of spreading equality that we often identify with democratic processes. I do not believe this is reality. This is not often reality. This is a dangerous ideological bias, unable to accept the profound changes of this era. In reality, globalization and reticularization, reticularization is the increasing density of the network, are different phenomena, each implying the other in certain respect, but maintaining their autonomy. Also, the latter, reticularization, is generally considered to be the product of the former, the product of globalization. In the present state, globalization can be limited successfully. On the contrary, reticularization cannot be avoided without losses, because the highest degree of interdependencies already achieved by the part in relation. I think we have to change our mind in considering globalization and reticularization. First of all, the nodes of the global network are not equal, and they are not going to be equal each other in the future. Each node is highly specific, different from the other nodes, and its ability to remain in relation with others depend on the differences. Diversity between nodes is the networking perspective. The specificity of each node is what we call identity. In this way, the strategic attention for managing the process of reticularization is focused on the specific nature of each node and on the characteristics of their links. Especially the links, the relationships, are the key to access for understanding the reticular system. We must be able to end the differences between the nodes, because the relational forms, the relational processes, are the cultural and the political elastics that permit the reticular form of the diversity. The conceptual distance between global and reticulars appear even greater if we consider the global is understood mainly as extensive, while reticular is understood as intensive. I'm going to explain. Globalization governance tends to expand its frontiers because the strategies is focused on the dimension of the control of the boundaries, focus on the object or value exchange. Networking governance, on the contrary, manage the relationship between the parts, because the strategy is focused on the definition of the relational protocols and to manage the channel of exchange. Thus, we are faced with scenarios where globalization and reticularization are processes correlated without a causal connection, but they cohabit in that dynamic world which is represented as functional connection between the two. The conclusion from this first point is summed up in the fact that the global network does not homogenize anything, but on the contrary, offer the possibility of a governance of the diversities, shift from the node to the relational link. Differences make relation possible. We can manage increasing interconnected system only if we assume governance as a dialogue between high specified cultural identities. The second point refers to the historical reason of the increase of importance of the intercultural dialogue debate, and has to do with the present pandemic, let me say. The world is in crisis. The virus, COVID-19, is the crisis par excellence. It is an event perceived as risky, harmful, and uncertain due to the lack of information that describes its effects. the pandemic is a booster of processes already in progress. Not only that, the pandemic has the unique characteristics such as being the first global crisis. Consider, there have been no known victims. For the first time at the global level, we had no known victims. Therefore, the intervention procedures suitable for macro-regional crises have not had the capacity to intervene at the global level for the first time. The global nature of the pandemic has not only had a negative effect on the management procedures, but also on the system of international relations, whose strategies have repositioned themselves by showing the fragmentation of the network system on the basis of local interest and the redefinition of relations through unusual alliance. Another unrealistic bias depicted solidarity as a possibility to face pandemic effects. Solidarity is a good narrative for people, but it is not a character of real politics. Look at what happened in the last year. We close barriers, we close borders. Finally, the pandemic was also the first communication crisis in the world of digital communication infrastructure, liquefying the control and the power system still structured on the principles of analog communication. All this has led to a suspended time in which individuals and organizations have been suddenly called upon to respond and change, necessarily adapting to the evolutionary uncertain scenario. This particular historical condition has sparkled conflicts at all levels between generations, between cities, between states, between people. This widespread uncertainty caused by the pandemic has accelerated the process of closure, of strengthening identity, which have represented the salvation, even cognitive, of the world changing too quickly to be understood. We cannot pretend that this has not happened. We have to admit we don't have the tools to change this trajectory quickly. I think we must accept the redefinition of networks on the basis of highly specific nodes. Going to close, differences make relations possible. We can manage increasing interconnected system only if we assume governance as a dialogue between high specified cultural identities. Finally, then we must see intercultural dialogue as a necessary strategy for dealing with this emergence. Intercultural dialogue as a tool accepting fragmentation, not pushing to an ideological equalitarian perspective, keeping together diversities. I repeat now our very first question. Are we sure that the intercultural dialogue is only important in Europe? No, I answer. It is important for all the world. Why intercultural dialogue matters more than ever in the EU? Because enlarged Europe, not EU, enlarged Europe, not real EU, is the oldest and greatest expression of different identities networking together. What we need is to assume a different perspective from the one that many people mean when dealing with these issues. It is important if we give up the past perspective of equality at all costs and differences as the source of evil. And intercultural dialogue should be considered important because it preserves the identity differences that make the functional relationship between the parts of a complex, fragmented network possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. After these three presentations, and I could see on my screen that some of you made notes of the panelists, I can imagine that maybe the one or the other would react to what one or the other said. Any reactions from the three panelists to a presentation of another panelist? Yes, Professor Lähdesmäki?
Well, shall I start, or who shall start? Well, first of all, I want to thank you, my co-panelist, for these very interesting and exciting presentations. If I say a couple of words to you, Kevin Pon, first, it was easy to agree with the points that you made, and particularly how you emphasized education as having a strong role in intercultural dialogue. I think that this is something that is very easy for all of us to agree. And you mentioned Erasmus program, for instance, there, and also that how even younger students could benefit from that kind of initiatives. And I definitely think that the earlier we start practicing and learning intercultural dialogue in schools, the better. So even very young children, I think that it's important to start with them, because they are our future citizens. You mentioned about Euroculture, and that had a title that there is no a single Euroculture. That's also easy to agree. I don't know how that is related to intercultural dialogue. I don't think that we need a single Euroculture to have intercultural dialogue, because intercultural dialogue is not about having the same culture, having a similar kind of European values or heritages or whatever. This European intercultural heaven and hell joke was a bit of a provocative, I would say, lifting up certain national stereotypes, but I think that was a choice that you wanted to make. Shall I continue with my comments to Marco Lombardi?
Yes.
Because I really liked your presentation, and it really gave food for thought. I certainly agree that the very concept of intercultural dialogue brings, interestingly, culture to the very heart of policy and politics. And I think that is definitely something that is important. I also liked your kind of semantic analysis of this concept. What I particularly wrote down, and I think this is something that I probably elaborate a bit more later, I really like this idea that intercultural dialogue is about keeping together diversities. I think this has a really interesting point. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Professor Pon, would you like to react?
Yes, I would like to react to Professor Lombardi. I think the diversity aspect is extremely important to keep, because that's part of our richness. So I don't think we should work to get it standardized, but as we mentioned, to understand it, to ensure that we keep what is rich. And I think that is very important, which adds to our diversity. And I also I completely agree with you about the comment, okay, there's a European diversity and culture, but it's also international as well, where we should be devising outside of Europe as well to the rest of the world, and to look at that. To my other correspondent, I appreciated the initiatives and the projects that you were working on cultural diversity and dialogue. I think they're very interesting to continue and pursue.
Professor Lombardi?
Yeah, I'm back. I'm back to you. Thanks for your comments. I wish to stress the problem how to keep differences as part of the dialogue. This is the real point. And let me say, it comes from my experience. I'm used to talk about intercultural dialogue, not in Europe, but out of Europe. As you described my CV, I'm part of a center working in critical area, mainly in critical area. In the last couple of years, I worked in Syria, in Somalia, in Libya, just to give you, in Tigray, north of Ethiopia. All those are critical area. And one of the key points, to help people to reconnect and to bring in peace is exactly try to understand how such diversities, different cultures, different behaviors, I'm talking about really ethnic, tribal behaviors, different, can keep together in these kind of societies. And a thing I learned browsing these countries is that any narrative talking about the possibility to have a common culture is going to lose. You have to work on the idea to make diversity acceptable by the different cultures. And you have to try to help people to understand the reason why the diversities are so effective in this area, and how keeping diversities alive is an added value for the complex system of making the relation among the different tribes and cultures and ethnic groups, let me say. If you try to homogenize, as you Kevin say, it is going to a disaster, absolutely a disaster. But sometimes the trend to homogenization, it is part of the common narrative you have, especially on the media. In Italy, still you have the idea that globalization and networking society is going to produce something that must be a common, a synthesis, some way cultural synthesis, a common culture that everyone has to accept. Absolutely out. From my point of view, it is absolutely out. And this is completely dangerous because, and this is the bad part, this is why I introduced pandemic. This crisis was really the booster of the polarization processes on the conflicting processes or already characterizing our world in the previous year. COVID, as any crisis boosted it, accelerated. And so I think that we have urgently to rethink cultural dialogue as the capability to manage diversity as functional part of the same more complex system than to get to the solution to have a more homogeneous system. I hope in some way I answered or I clarified my idea that really come from my browsing of this critical area in the world.
Thanks a lot. Before I ask the audience to come with questions, I do already see that there are some in the question and answer sections. I would like to ask myself a question and come back to what was said about, don't know by whom, if I understood it correct, that there is no European culture, but there are different cultures in Europe. And when I'm talking about Europe, then I mean not only the European Union, because the European Union is not all of Europe. We have other European countries which are not in the European Union. And I asked that question because I'm working for the Pan-European Union, the Pan-European Movement. The founder of this organization, Richard Kudnowy-Kalergi, wrote in, I don't know which article it was, I think it was also in the book Paneuropa in the 20s, so about 100 years ago, that we can speak about a European culture. So this was the opposite of your messages, if I understood it correct. And I said we have some kind of common roots in Europe, like Christianity, like traditions, like marriage between men and women, like private property, etc. So was he wrong? The first question. Second question, if we do not have one European culture, which also, and I don't want to say that this is all the same, yeah? I'm not talking about the melting pot. Culture can also be that you have differences. You even have differences in the dialect between Vienna and Tyrol. And this is so high, this difference, that they do not understand each other if they speak only their dialect. But if we do not have some kind of common roots in Europe, cultural roots, what does this mean for the process of European unification? Is this then just an ideal which we can never reach? Or is there some kind of common identity which would have to be, how to say that, much more presented so that people understand why this European Union or this European unification makes sense? Who would like to start? Okay, you just unmute your microphone.
Yeah, if you want, I can come back immediately because you are quite provocative, but I will try to be brief. First, I really believe in a European culture, not in EU culture. That's different. So what I argue that I wish to stress common root in terms of, I say, enlarged Europe, but not in the EU. That is something different. So we have to go to the root of an enlarged Europe asset. Second point, and I close, why? Also because I do not believe that that nation state, as we know, still can be part of our political future. So I think really my of course grandfather, old ancient father fought against Austria, of course, 150 years ago, more or less, and so on. Okay, that's clear, and so I accept, and I'm happy of Italy as the result in 1860, of course, but now is over. The game was over. This kind of political game is over because the result in establishing the Europe by this national state failed. We have to go back and we accept, that's my idea. When they talk about a fragmented reality, I think that a more dense network in terms also of political identities in Europe can make the continent, the new Europe, better than now. 28, no, 54 or 75 together from common roots. That's my idea, my answer to you.
Okay, this was now a good example of different cultures in Europe. I don't know if you could see it on your screen, but Professor Lähdesmäki raised her hand and I said, you can unmute your microphone, and Professor Lombardi started to speak. What interesting to see that, to observe that. Professor Lähdesmäki, now it's up to you.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I think that this is a really interesting and important question. Of course, there are several books written about this question about European culture, European identity, and I can even share you soon a link to a forthcoming book in which me and my research team are exploring this topic. But very briefly, I think that there isn't just one European culture, but several European cultures, because it depends how you define it. And of course, you know, European culture means very different things for different people. So I think that we need to speak that in plural form. So there are different European cultures, which can be actually very different. And of course, in previous literature, there is this kind of classical categorization of cultural European identity and then civic European identity, when the first one is based on emphasizing shared cultural roots, while the other one is based on emphasizing shared values. for instance, those values that are mentioned in the Treaty of Lisbon, like these different values of liberal democratic societies. And personally, I think that it is actually a bit dangerous to emphasize too much this cultural understanding of European identity and these cultural roots, because we know that we have a lot of Europeans, a lot of people in Europe who do not share these roots. So I think that it is rather exclusive to try to build European culture, European identity based on that kind of historical cultural roots or heritage. So this is what I wanted to say.
Professor Paul?
Yes, I completely agree with what you say. There are definitely several or many different European cultures are available. And I think I'd go on to add that what makes it more enriching and possibly more complex is the fact that across these different European cultures, we're seeing different layers of cultures. For example, like youth culture, where we can see young people in France have much more in common with their peers in Spain or Portugal rather than with their older grandparents. And so what we're seeing is a horizontal and a vertical crossing of cultures, which makes it much more interesting and diverse, which is something which then I come back to Marco's comment, which is diversity, which we should keep, because that is part of us and helps us to develop and helps us to understand things as well. Because if we can get people crossing cultures and national identities and becoming similar in some aspects, that's bridging the gap of our differences and understanding.
Okay, thank you. In that stage, I would like to come to the questions from our audience. And I do already have some questions in the questions and answers sections. The first one is from Christoph Ledl. He asks that differences should not be done away with. This means they, not they. They are beautiful and useful. Don't you think we should learn to be interested in these differences? If we are interested, there will always be a reason for cultural dialogue. Professor Paul, you wrote that you are going to answer this question, please.
Yes, I think we've already answered that to some extent, so that our differences should be kept to the utmost, because if they're not, we'll become much poorer as individuals of a society. And these differences, provided that we learn to accept and show empathy to these differences, it can create much more harmony amongst us and understanding to go and develop further. But that doesn't mean we should standardize them and make them the same or eliminate them. It's a good thing that they're still there and that we keep them and we understand them, and they can be much more interesting to experiment with, to see what different people in different European countries or different places have cultures, to make us as more enriching people as well and understanding as we go on in life.
So this means we support the EU slogan, what is it? United in diversity, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's correct, yes.
Yeah, okay. Anybody else who wants to react on this question from Christoph? Okay, then I come to the second question from a man with a very complicated name, Osuma. Please, do you agree that intercultural dialogue will reshape and eradicate the invincible change in Europe, specifically as observed by Rousseau? So he's going back in history and philosophy. In his publication, Social Contract Theory, Cyprus' problem is a focal attraction with intercultural dialogue in Europe and can provide a leeway too. Can anybody react to that? I'm not an expert in Rousseau, so I cannot react to Rousseau. Okay. So we go to the next question from Klaus Valentin. What kind of desire will the people have in the future? And he added a second question. How would you interpret the EU intention for a smart specialization in this context? Specialization.
Well, if I could take the first one, that seems to be the easier question out of the two questions. I think what are people looking forward to in the future is possibly a more stabilized cultural atmosphere where people can exchange far easier and to discover new things, which again is highlighting what we've said throughout this session, that there is diversity. So I think a lot of people want to discover and keep that diversity so that they can go and keep on discovering things and make life interesting. I don't think the desire is to make a standardized European cultural dialogue. It would be very negative of us, and it wouldn't be very interesting for us to do, and it would probably eliminate all sorts of innovation and creativity between us as well, if this was to happen. So I'm saying that by the powers of the different medias of communication that are open to us, I'm suggesting that we may discover more and more diversity between us, which will be more enriching and enhance creation, innovation and diversity.
Okay. Are there, Professor Lähdesmäki, and then Dejan.
Yeah, I just could quickly continue from that. So I think that, this is an interesting question about desires of people and how they see their future. And I think that usually people just, they just want to live common everyday life and be safe and, nothing that more particular. So I think that is a really kind of easy desire to be responded by living just a common life and interacting with people who are around you. So I think that there isn't any more complex in that. And also now coming from that also to the previous question about this the curiosity aspect, and I think that is also something that is really important. And as you, Kevin, already said, that having a curious attitude towards life and towards other people is the first step towards being able to having intercultural dialogue, communicate with others and feeling empathy. So I think that it is a really important feature and attitude to have.
May I answer? Just a very, very brief. I'm used to say that the real desire of any people is to have a future, think tomorrow, to have a tomorrow equal as today, except that because tomorrow cannot be boring for you, you must feel, not understand. There is some difference in between tomorrow and today. You have just to feel the difference, but not to understand. If tomorrow match this little difference with today, it is really what you desire. Because people do not want any surprise. Remember that. Surprise, it is absolutely out of a common culture or a common desire of people. So we wanted tomorrow equal to today, but not boring us. This is, if you can manage this, you have all the people. And in some way, smart specialization, it is something, I do not really know very well smart specialization, but as far as what I read, is a good idea by EU to bring in diversities, because it is smart specialization is a way to develop an economic approach based on more regional opportunities. And yes, focus, that means really focus, smart specialization and little specialization, but focus on regional opportunities. So in one sense, it is going to drive to keeping diversity, having reorganize it in economic perspective. That is what I kept, at least by this approach.
Thank you. Dejan, I think you wanted to ask a question or make some remarks.
In fact, I wanted to touch upon the smart specialization, but it's just Professor Lombardi who answered. Basically, I had the comment in the same direction. So that's, I mean, I don't really see the real connection between the intercultural dialogue future and the smart specialization, because this is a very, very different strategy for the future of Europe. So, as I said, it was already explained.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit on John Stuart Mill. I think it was John Stuart Mill with his, what was it, comparative, whatever it was in economics. I have a question by Mario Fantini. He sent it to me by email. Mario, you should be able to speak if you unmute your microphone.
Yes, thank you, Rainer. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Very interesting. Thank you, everybody. And I'm about to leave, but I do have a question. It's perhaps more theoretical, philosophical. I'm reminded of Rémi Brague, the French philosopher, who had written and argued that there is something common to all European cultures and to the West, which he called Romanitas, referring to Europe's ability to absorb, embrace, and be transformed and enriched continually by the influx and influence of other cultures. So does this not sound like a suitable and an appropriate approach to what we're talking about? An approach that allows for both an encounter with the so-called other, while at the same time recognizing that there is something we all have in common, this thing called Romanitas that underlies European civilization. Thank you.
So who would like to start? Answering? Yeah, Professor Lähdesmäki.
Okay, yeah, but thank you very much for this comment, and which is a really interesting one. And I think that this is something that is quite easily recognized, that there is something common in Europe in a kind of very broad sense when we travel to other continents. So I think that this is something that kind of we can recognize, but it is very difficult to put into words that how to describe it, that what is it. I don't really like the word or term of mentality, because it has been used in various and also in racist ways. But I think that there are differences between broad regions, broad continents that are easy to recognize. So in that sense, I definitely kind of I see the point, and I understand this concept of Romanitas. But yeah, so but kind of or whether it is about, of course, all people, if you think about human beings, we do also have things in common. So how to then kind of come from that very common level to different continents and try to define that what is the thing that is shared and common for us in Europe, for instance. But of course, that is one way to approach this through this concept and how you explain it.
Would the others like to react on that? Otherwise, I come to the next question. Okay, so I go to the next question which is directly to Professor Paul from Maximilian Schmidt, and he comes back to the experiment you made, and asks if you think that this is representative for these three countries' culture, and if the results are more than just cliches, could this information have an important impact on the future European dialogue?
I would just like to say that I think that what is happening today is because we are mixing more and more together, that our cultures and our ways of thinking and our morals are changing and are adapting slowly, but there are still traits and characteristics which keep us innate. There's certain basic differences which do remain with us, and I would think that that is not by any means, if we learn to live with that, a difficulty. It can enhance us. If I speak from my experience of a British person living in France for over 25 years, I still get annoyed with some of the French culture because I think it's very, very slow in some cases. And whereas I would rather prefer to analyze less and get things going. But at the same token, I've learned that by analyzing a certain number of things before acting can sometimes, very often, save us time. So I think that, yes, deep down, we still have these common things through what we've lived for during our youth, during our childhood, during our education process, which still remain us. But talking about adapting and changing, yes, we can adapt and change, and to help us to move forward in different areas. So I would say, yes, they are certainly stereotypes to a certain extent. They exist with us as well, but at different degrees, so, according to our experience and our past and what we've lived through through our lives.
Before I come to my last question and the closing remarks, a last question from the audience. At this point, I want to apologize to those who ask questions, and there have been 2 or 3 other very, very long questions that we don't have enough time to answer all of them. This question is again from Christoph, who is working as a financial advisor, and he says the British annoyed him every day with their ideas and regulations. Now, as we have Brexit, he is missing them, and asks the question if you think that this is a good example for the effect of the lost multiplicity. Did we lost, let me say it in my words, did we lose something because of Brexit, Professor Paul?
Well, I think, I'm not sure that you lost something, but I'm sure the British lost something out of it, definitely. And you never know what you have until you've lost it. And it's something that's going to be a part of our culture that's going to be less rich in the future. Now, I like the anecdote of the contributions of the British and the financial aspect. But obviously, when you miss out on something, or you move to another country and you miss out on certain cultural aspects, you become a lesser person, I think. And it's something that you would wish you'd kept. So I think it's important that losing something very often is very negative, even if when you had it, you thought it was negative. Because it's something that makes us different and work together and try and work for a common goal. So even my conclusion to that is, even if you lose something that's negative, it's probably a bad thing in the long run.
Thanks, Professor Lombardi.
No, it's the interesting end of Kevin, that if you lose something that is negative, that is negative in the long run, especially if we reflect on the Brexit. I don't know about the real answer to our friends that is a financial advisor, but I think that anyway, EU legislation will be quickly overhead the loss of the UK legislation. So I think that he will have to experience a new European legislation that will change the UK experience. So don't have a doubt about that.
Okay, Professor Lähdesmäki.
Yeah, so there has been a lot of discussion, of course, that what happens to the EU when the UK is out. But of course, I think that, UK is still very much in the European community, and I think that all the kind of personal connections that we have to people in UK, they will stay. But it will be interesting to see that how big change this eventually is for the EU and for the UK as well, and kind of at what level these changes will then emerge. But yeah, if the one who posed this question thinks that this is a good example of the effects of the lost multiplicity, so then it is in that way for him at least.
Okay, so let's come to the last round in this discussion. I would like to ask the panelists for their conclusion of this discussions, and I would like to add another question, but ask for a short answer. How would you give a definition of European identity, if you have a definition of European identity? Professor Lombardi, a quick response from Italy, from Milano.
Yeah, I was answering. Just give me 30 seconds to think about, because it is nearly impossible to give an answer. If I go back to what we discussed in the last year, of course, I have to quote the common root, but it is too easy. It doesn't make sense. Probably the answer is that I cannot identify except the most common and probably unuseful narrative, something in common, except really the diversity. Europe was always diverse inside. This is a good point, except a very large root. Okay, Christianity. Okay, we can talk about Judaism, Christianity, and so on as the main root, but so wide that everything can be accepted in. It means that we are the country, the state of diversities. This is a good point. If we accept that we are the region of diversities, it seems to me that the EU in the last 50 years built up some problem more than solutions. Because in the last 50 years, EU tried to draw us to something unique instead of to governance our diversities. So still, I go back what I said, but it is a big issue, but also I think the great heritage of diversities of the Europeans, it is what Europe has to consider to make the region as a unit.
Thank you, Professor Paul.
Yeah, I think our European identity is possibly based on three elements: diversity, acceptance, and adapting. Because we're very close in proximity very often. And I would like to address my final comment to my Italian partner there, Marco. I would hate for you to come to England and think of a pizza where we put pineapple on to eat. And so I think that sums it up of our European identity, is accepting their diversity, and then adapting it to our own personal, national or local identity. And the pineapple on pizza would probably shock lots of Italians, but it's a very great popular dish in the United Kingdom to eat. So I think that sums it up. That's my definition.
Thanks a lot, Professor Lähdesmäki.
Okay, thank you. So this is, of course, again, a rather big question, but I think that I could answer to that in a similar way what I answered to the question on European culture. So again, I think that there are various European identities, and those can be based on culture, or the civic values, or seeing it as a liberal European identity or conservative European identity. So there is a diversity of European identities. And I think that in general, I mean, I don't know how Europeans themselves feel about their own identity, because when we were doing with my research team ethnographic field research in 12 European countries, couple of years ago, and we have just written a book about it. I posted an email, the web address to this forthcoming book. So when we were interviewing and asking about the question of European identity from our informants, that we had nearly 2,000 in this book. So quite many people said that, I don't know what is a European identity, or I don't have a European identity. But when we ask that, do you feel that you belong to Europe, or do you feel that you have a sort of a feeling of belonging to Europe? So it was very easy for people to say that, yeah, sure, I'm European and I feel that I belong to Europe, but I don't have a European identity. So it seems that the whole concept or term of European identity seems to be something rather complex and difficult for people. But then when we did these interviews and led people to talk about their Europeanness or how they saw the European, there were two things that were particularly emphasized. And one of them was diversity. Quite many people saw that, okay, that is something that is very characteristic to Europe and European identity and European culture and so on and so forth. And the other one was mobility. Quite many people mentioned that they have been mobile themselves. They have been in different countries and they like that, and it is part of their feeling of belonging to Europe. So these two things were quite often mentioned, that these were the most mentioned features that Europeans that we interviewed and researched identified to European identity and Europe. So mobility and diversity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, professors, for your contributions, for the living discussions. Thanks also to the participants for questions. For me, it was very, very interesting to listen to you and to ask some questions. I hope it was as interesting as it was for me, for you, for the panelists, and also for the participants. We move on in our program today, but we move on with a break. And this break will last till 4:30. At 4:30, a young, attractive lady will take over, Teodora Ladic, and she will then moderate the second panel. So please stay online. See you in 20 minutes.